Mr. Mοντάνιον, public trust in Europe and internationally has eroded since the banking crisis of 2008-2009, which came a few years after the other crisis that created the Infocom bubble. Can corporate governance help the financial sector and the big businesses in general regain this trust, and how?
First of all, I do think that companies have to be quite careful to show proper accountability. We used to think that the accountability was primarily to the shareholders, and that's still the case. But there is a growing awareness that companies have to be accountable to society at large, because it's society which gives them their license to operate. Governance is a part of that, because a lot of governance is about organising the way you do things to ensure that the accountability is retained, is developed and retained. So governance has a role to play, very definitely.
You speak about a new model, a new business model. Can you describe this new model, and if we need also new business ethics in this model?
Well, this is all linked to culture and values and ethics. What I was saying in my speech was that you can't run a business without having a business model. A business model is what actually drives your business and makes it unique. So that you have a niche in the market, or you're doing things in a particular way. And you can't have a business model without that saying something about your underlying values. A lot of companies are not really aware about their business model. They're certainly not aware about the impact of their underlying values. But if those underlying values lead to a business model which essentially involves exploiting customers and not delivering value to them, then the business is not going to have a good future. And getting the values informing the business model, making sure that the values actually then infuse the whole workforce and actually are reflected in everything the company does, is a very important task. It's related to governance because it actually helps manage risk and it helps make a stronger company. But it goes beyond what we normally think of in terms of governance as being more simply about how boards of companies operate. On European level, do we need more regulation or self-regulation? How also do you judge the initiatives of the European Commission on the subject? Well, I think the use of the word self-regulation is a very bad one, if you'll forgive me for saying so, because we don't want self-regulation, we want accountability. What we need is a regulatory framework which encourages that accountability, but then perhaps gives certain freedoms within it. We can have that framework if the trust is there. So trust, if the public trust in business is high, and if that is evidenced by good quality behaviour by businesses, there is less pressure for regulation. That means that companies are facing less interference, it's less expensive for them to operate, and they are sounder long-term businesses. Now, I'd like to get to that point where we're relying less on regulation, but I don't think we can actually substitute self-regulation for regulation in those areas which will always exist, where you actually have to have regulation. Now, an example of that is it's got to be a regulatory requirement for companies to produce audited accounts. That's something we have to expect them to do. What we want companies to do, which you can't regulate for, is to have good quality behaviour among them, the board and among the employees. We want companies to treat their customers well and their stakeholders well, because that leads in the long run to success. And the size of a company should be taken into consideration, and what should be done also for the unlisted companies and the smaller size? There is a lot of pressure from smaller companies, and I think this is particularly relevant in a country like Greece, where there is a very big small company sector, and we are looking to smaller companies to be dynamic and lead the recovery. There's a lot of pressure from the small companies to be let off the requirements of regulation.
I'm a little bit sceptical about this. I think all regulation should be proportional, proportionate, but I also think that these points that I'm making about value, about business models, about standards of behaviour should apply to small companies as well as large companies if we really believe that this sort of thing makes companies better companies. It makes small companies into better companies as well as large ones, and they need to think about it seriously.
And finally, what do you answer to the main question of this conference? Can corporate governance contribute to long-term investments in Greece?
I believe it can and it should, though it is actually quite difficult to produce the kind of academic evidence which would support that. But one of the things I think that Greece will need in the recovery is investment. It will need investment, probably quite a lot of investment from overseas, or maybe investment from Greek people who've gone to live overseas or who have money overseas. And that money will come back if the investors trust the companies. So this is another very important point. You can attract investment more easily if you're transparent, if you actually are a well-run company and the financial markets can see that.